There's a version of California that doesn't exist anymore. Not the California of postcards or movie sets or real estate listings, a different one. The one that smelled like sunscreen and dry grass and whatever they used to clean the floors at school. The one where Saturday morning had a specific sound, cartoons bleeding through a closed bedroom door before anyone else in the house was awake. If you grew up there in the 1980s, you know exactly what I mean. And if you didn't, you can feel it at the edges of what I'm describing, even now. These are 10 things that shaped you in that place and in that time. Not the big things, the invisible ones. The systems and rituals and textures that were just the way life worked until one day, quietly, they weren't anymore. The smog check ritual and what it meant. There was a color that Southern California sky turned on certain afternoons in the 1980s. Not quite orange, not quite brown, something in between, a haze that sat on top of the San Gabriel Mountains like a lid. And on those days, the announcer on KFWB or KNX would say it matter-of-factly between the traffic report and the weather, Stage 1 smog alert in effect for the South Coast Air Basin. What happened next is what most people outside California never fully understood. PE class moved indoors, recess got shortened. Teachers in the San Fernando Valley and the Inland Empire told kids not to run at lunch. Parents drove to school instead of letting kids walk. It was a full infrastructure, a parallel school day that activated quietly, without drama, the way a contingency plan activates. And kids absorbed it. You didn't question it, you just understood that on those afternoons, the air itself had a different set of rules. In Northern California, up near Sacramento and Stockton, it was a different kind of sky, more dust than exhaust, but the same seasonal rhythm, the same brown edge on the horizon in July and August, the same adjustment in how you moved through the day. What the smog alert was, in its way, was California's version of weather, except it wasn't natural. It was proof that millions of people were trying to live and work and get somewhere all at once in a geography that had no outlet for what they left behind. And children who grew up inside that system learned something profound without anyone ever teaching it, that the air you breathe is a shared resource, and sometimes that resource gets used up. Nobody called it that. They just said Stage 1 and moved PE inside.
The specific language of California school mornings. If you remember the sound of that bell, not the regular bell, the other one, you know exactly what I'm talking about. California schools in the 1980s ran on a drill schedule that was unlike anywhere else in the country. Fire drills, yes, but also earthquake drills, drop, cover, hold on, and the strange, specific ritual of getting under a wooden desk and putting your arms over your neck, which even then felt like a gesture of hope more than actual protection. But the drill itself wasn't the thing. The thing was what came before and after. Before, the moment the teacher said, "Okay, we're going to practice today," and the particular sound the classroom made as 30 kids scraped back their chairs in unison, a sound that exists nowhere else on earth. After, the way everyone filed back into their seats with a slightly different energy, a little quieter, because something had just reminded you, briefly and without ceremony, that the ground itself was not entirely reliable. In California in the 1980s, you went to school on the edge of the Pacific Plate. You learned multiplication, and you learned that the earth moved. Both facts were just facts. Neither one was more remarkable than the other. And that normalization, that complete integration of geological instability into the texture of a Tuesday, is one of the most distinctly Californian things that ever happened to a generation of children. It made you calm in a particular way, unflappable about things you couldn't control, a little fatalistic, but cheerfully so. The mall as operating system. Let's be precise about what the mall actually was. It was not primarily a place to shop. That was incidental. What the mall was in California in the 1980s was the first place you were allowed to exist in public without a parent. Southland Mall, Puente Hills, Northridge, Valco, Sun Valley. The names are geography now. They map a California that was organizing itself around the car and the suburb, and the idea that everything you needed could be indoors and air-conditioned and accessible on a Saturday afternoon. You knew the layout of your local mall the way you knew the layout of your own house. Better, maybe. You knew which entrance the security guard favored. You knew the path between the record store and the food court that let you avoid the cologne counter at Macy's. You knew that the orange Julius near the east entrance was faster than the one by the escalators. And you knew the social topography. Which section of the food court was claimed by which grade, the unspoken etiquette of the arcade, who was waiting on which machine, what constituted cutting, the way Saturday afternoon had a completely different social density than Saturday morning, and how the whole environment shifted at around 4 o'clock when the older kids arrived. What the mall was building without any adult noticing was civic competence. You were learning to navigate a shared public space, to read social signals, to manage your presence among strangers. You were learning, in the language of the 1980s California suburb, how to be a person in the world. Nobody designed it that way. It just happened, in the echo of tile floors and the smell of Auntie Anne's pretzel dough and the particular way the afternoon light came through the skylights in December. The drive-in as family ritual. What you might not remember is what happened before you even left the driveway. The preparation for a drive-in trip in Southern California in the 1980s was its own event. You put on pajamas before you left the house. You loaded the back seat or the station wagon with blankets and pillows. Someone, always someone, brought a grocery bag of food from home because the concession stand was too expensive and the popcorn at home was better anyway. California's drive-ins existed in this particular geographic logic. They needed space, which the Valley had, and warm evenings, which California had reliably from April through October. The Van Nuys Drive-In, the Vineland Drive-In in the City of Industry, the Capitol Drive-In up in Sacramento. Double features every weekend and sometimes triple features, which meant that children fell asleep somewhere in the middle of the second film and woke up in their own beds with no memory of how they got there. The drive-in was the last public space in American life where it was genuinely acceptable for a family to be in their own private bubble while also being part of a crowd. You were together in your car, which was your living room, which happened to be parked in a lot with 500 other living rooms, all facing the same enormous screen. It was communal solitude. It was California's version of the town square. By the end of the 1980s, most of them were gone. The land was worth more as a swap meet, and then as a big box retail strip, and then as something else. The ritual survived longer in memory than it did in practice, and in the memory it's always warm, and the speakers always have that particular crackle of AM audio through a metal box hung on a rolled-down window.
The video store as neighborhood institution. There was a man named Carl, or someone like Carl, at every video store in California in the 1980s. He knew what you liked. He'd say, "You returned Ghostbusters last week. You want something like that?" and gesture toward a section of the store you'd never thought to look at. He knew your family by your account number, which was a laminated card in your mother's wallet, and he knew, without being told, that you were allowed to rent PG-13 but not R. The video store in 1980s California was not a retail transaction. It was a neighborhood institution with a social ecology as complex as any library or barber shop. There were hierarchies, new releases on the wall at eye level, older titles in the alphabetical bins you had to crouch for. There was a code of conduct,
Rewind before you return, no sticky cases, no late fees on holidays if you were a good customer. There was local knowledge. The warehouse on Van Nuys Boulevard had a bigger horror section. The Tower Video on Watt Avenue in Sacramento was where you found the foreign films. And there was the Friday night ritual of standing in front of the new release wall for 20 minutes while your parents argued about what to watch, which was its own form of family togetherness that nobody would have recognized as such at the time. What the video store was, invisibly, was an analog recommendation engine run by people who actually watched movies and cared what you thought of them. It was community curation. It was the particular magic of a place where the inventory was finite and the knowledge was local and the transaction was personal. Tower Records and the education of listening. Nobody explained this to you, you just absorbed it. Tower Records on Sunset, Tower Records on Watt Avenue in Sacramento, which was the original, Tower Records on Bay Street in San Jose. These were not record stores in the conventional sense. They were institutions of musical education that didn't charge tuition. You walked in looking for one thing and came out knowing about 6 other things you didn't know you needed. The staff recommendations were handwritten on index cards tucked into the bins. The listening stations, the ones where you could put on headphones and actually hear the record before you bought it, created this private experience in the middle of a public space, a moment of isolation that was somehow the opposite of loneliness. And the geography of the store itself was a kind of curriculum. The jazz section was next to the classical section, which was next to the world music section, which meant that browsing for one thing led you accidentally through the territory of something else. You became, without meaning to, the kind of person who knew something about music beyond the narrow band you'd started with. The invisible architecture here was the physical arrangement of a room. The fact that records took up space, that space was organized by someone with opinions, that those opinions were legible to anyone willing to walk the aisle slowly enough. You couldn't search by algorithm. You had to be present. You had to look. That particular form of serendipitous discovery, the thing you didn't know you were looking for, is what died when the physical store died. And people who grew up inside it carry a habit of mind that the rest of the culture has slowly been losing ever since. The beach as operating ritual, not destination. Here's the thing about the beach that people outside California misunderstand. For kids who grew up within 30 miles of the Pacific coast in the 1980s, the beach was not a destination. It was not something you planned or packed a bag for or drove hours to reach. It was the default. It was what happened on a Saturday when nothing else was organized. It was where you went the way you went to the backyard. And because it was that ordinary, it had rituals that were invisible precisely because they were so routine. The way you knew which section of the beach was yours, not by legal ownership, but by accumulated social geography. The same blanket placement 3 Saturdays in a row until the spot had a kind of claim. The specific etiquette of the water, the unspoken rules about who was waiting for a wave, what counted as dropped in on someone's ride. The hierarchy of the lineup at a good break, which was as strictly organized as any social institution and enforced entirely by collective agreement with no written rules and no referee. The zinc oxide, the particular brand of sunscreen that smelled like coconut and left a white ring around the collar of your shirt for the rest of the day. The way the marine layer came back in the late afternoon and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in 40 minutes, which was the ocean's signal that the day was over and everyone accepted it without argument. What the beach gave those California kids was a relationship with something larger and older and completely indifferent to their plans. You could not negotiate with the ocean. You could not schedule it. You could not improve it with technology. You could only show up, understand its current mood, and adjust accordingly. That's not a small thing to grow up knowing. Saturday morning as a protected ecology. There was a sound that Saturday morning made that doesn't exist anymore. It was the sound of cartoons through a closed door, which meant someone else in the house was already awake and you'd missed the beginning of something. It was the specific audio texture of a television at low volume because you'd turned it down when you woke up before everyone else, as an act of consideration so automatic it felt instinctive. It was the sound of a house in that particular Saturday morning condition, not fully awake, not yet organized, suspended in a permission structure that only existed between roughly 7 and 11 a.m. In California in the 1980s, the Saturday morning cartoon block was an ecology. It had a beginning, the farm report or the news signing off, the transition moment when the programming shifted, and it had an ending, which was when the live-action programming started and the morning was officially over. Everything in between was governed by rules that children understood perfectly and adults largely left alone. You knew the schedule, not from a TV guide, you'd memorized it. You knew that certain shows came before certain other shows, and that the quality of the morning depended on which network you'd committed to at the outset. You knew which cereals were permitted. The good ones were for Saturday, weekdays were for Cheerios and being reasonable about things. And you understood, without anyone telling you, that Saturday morning was yours, not just the television, the entire morning, the whole tempo of it, the right to be completely useless until noon. That's gone now, in the obvious sense that the Saturday morning cartoon block no longer exists as a cultural institution. But something else is also gone. The idea that children deserved unscheduled time, that being a child included large expanses of morning that belonged to nobody and were governed by no productivity.
The wildfire as seasonal fact. You knew the smell before you saw the smoke. It came from the east usually, from the canyons east of Pasadena, or the hills above Malibu, or the dry ridge behind Santa Rosa. It smelled like wood smoke, but not like campfire. More acrid than that, with a particular dryness that settled at the back of your nose and stayed there. And before any news report or any adult confirmed anything, you knew there was a fire, and the Santa Ana winds were blowing, and October had arrived in the way October always arrived in California. In the 1980s, the annual fire season was already a fact of California life. Not the catastrophic weeks-long mega-fire events of later years. Those came with compounding consequences that 1980s California was still building toward. But fire was a season, the same way spring and summer and winter were seasons. You knew it by the ash on the windshield in the morning, by the way the sky at sunset went from orange to red to deep purple in a sequence you'd seen before, by the particular quality of the air that school kids described as smoky and adults called degraded air quality, and both groups simply accepted as the cost of living somewhere beautiful and dry. What the fire season installed in California children, invisibly, year after year, was a particular relationship with impermanence. Houses burned, hills burned. The same hills you hiked in spring were black by November, and somehow, by the following April, they were green again. The landscape recovered. Life came back, in a different form from what looked like total destruction. That is not a small thing to grow up seeing. It leaves a residue, an understanding of cycles that exists beneath the level of conscious thought, a quiet knowledge that loss is not always final, and that recovery takes exactly as long as it takes, and not a day less. The freeway as inner life. This is the one nobody ever puts on a list, the freeway. Not as transportation infrastructure, though it was that, not as the defining feature of Southern California geography, though it was that too. The freeway as the place where the interior life of a California childhood actually happened,
where the long, meditative space between one thing and another got filled with music and radio and the shifting light through a car window, and the particular peace of being in motion without being in charge of the motion. Parents drove. Children sat in the back or in the front seat before seatbelt laws changed the geography of the family car, and watched the exits go by. Harbor, Rosecrans, Inglewood, University. You learned the freeway exits as vocabulary. You knew the ones that meant you were almost home and the ones that meant you were just getting started. You knew which interchange felt like the beginning of something good. The freeway in 1980s California was the place where conversations happened that couldn't happen at a dinner table, where the lack of eye contact and the forward motion and the sense that the conversation would end in a finite number of exits made certain things easier to say. California children grew up having their most important conversations in a car, moving, on the way somewhere. What the freeway gave you, in the end, was a particular tolerance for transition, for being between places, between states, between the thing you were going to and the thing you were leaving. California kids could be in transit without needing to have arrived. They were comfortable in motion. They'd been trained for it, exit by exit, their whole lives. And here is the thing about all 10 of these: the smog and the drills and the mall and the drive-in and the records and the beach and the cartoons and the fire and the freeway. None of them were meant to shape you. There was no plan. No adult looked at Stage 1 smog alerts and thought, this will teach children to share public resources. No parent packed pajamas for the drive-in and thought, this will give them a relationship with communal solitude. No city planner laid out a freeway grid and thought, this will become the architecture of intimate conversation for the next 40 years. They were just the way life worked. And the way life worked, quietly, without announcement, is what made you who you are.